All right, this is tape number 7, and we're talking again about current political issues, and we're continuing our conversation on what is going on with the federal government and its budget. Remember, we talked about the budget, the debt, and the deficit in the previous tape. And in this tape, I just want to talk briefly about what in the world the U.S. government spends all its money on. Okay? So, it's pretty simple. I want to use the current budget, okay, the one that is going on, the fiscal year FY 2020 budget. This is a budget that ends at the end of September of 2020. So, what does it spend its money on? Well, the first thing, the biggest expenditure in the budget is Medicare. Medicare, of course, is health care for the elderly, 65 and older, and it spends, you ready for this? $1,263 billion on Medicare, on health care for the poor. Okay? So, that's the first thing, and believe it or not, that's the biggest expenditure that we have. The next expenditure, sorry, I dropped my board here. The next expenditure is Social Security. And remember, Social Security includes money for the elderly. So what we have is Medicare, health care for the elderly, and Social Security, which are basically checks to the elderly. Okay? And how much is that? That is $1,055 billion. So, you look at the two of these things, and actually, I made a mistake here. This should be a trillion, and this should be a trillion. So, remember the budget is more than $4 trillion. Well, here's half of it. Okay? Half of the money that the government spends goes to senior citizens. 1.23 trillion and 1.05. That is half of the money. You know, we have to ask ourselves, why is so much money? Why does so much money go to senior citizens? Well, number one, we're taking care of them. There's an obligation that we assume to take care of them. Number two, remember when we talked about population, there's a lot of senior citizens. They're about 23% of the population. Okay? So, they get a lot of money. But there's a third reason that to me is really important. Senior citizens vote. Young people don't vote. Turns out that in an average election, an average presidential election, young people vote about a quarter of the time. So 1 out of 4 young people vote. Senior citizens, about 70% vote. And politicians reward citizens who turn out at the polls. And here you go. Here's prime evidence of it. Okay, once we've got this done, what else does the government spend its money on? Because this is only half of the budget. Okay? By the way, remember, this money comes from payroll taxes that are collected by the government. We're going to get into that in subsequent, in actually the next tape. Okay, so these are specific taxes that we pay out that pay for this. Okay, next. The next thing is defense. My pen isn't very great. I'll replace it for the next one. Defense spending, taking care of our military. That works out in the current budget to be $700 billion. $700 billion. We by far have the largest military in the world. We spend the most money on the military. President Trump claims that he has increased defense spending, and he's absolutely correct. He has. Not that it was slack under Barack Obama, but President Trump has upped it to more than $700 billion. That's in 1 year. Okay? And then the next thing is interest. We've talked about the debt. Well, you know that debt that the United States government has, the $26 trillion debt, you got to pay interest on it. How much is that interest? Right now, it works out to be about $377 billion a year. And the higher the debt goes, the higher the interest payment goes. Okay? So, these two are driven by age. The number of elderly we have causes these to go up. If we ever have less elderly, these will go down. The defense is driven by our own definition of what we need to take care of our country. And then interest on the debt, that is driven by the debt. We promised we'd pay interest. We're paying interest. Okay, so this is what our government spends its money on. These are the basic things. Okay, there's a lot of other things that the government spends its money on. Okay, I mean, just the cost of the president's transportation, student loans. You know, if any of you have student loans, that is provided by the government. National parks, the highways, some welfare payments, payments for farmers. You know, the list can go on and on and on and on. The government does a lot of things. But in the end, to understand where most of the money goes, it's right here. This is $2 trillion. This is another $3 trillion, another $1 trillion. So you add these together, $3 trillion out of the $4 trillion in debt is for just 4 things. All right? The next tape, we're going to be talking about taxes.